I don't know.
Straight talk. Money matters. International news. Celebrity interviews. Sports.
If I'm being discriminated based on my race, it's not.
Politics. Race.
Let's switch it around. Let's talk healthcare.
Straight talk with award-winning journalist Lloyd Geit.
Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm your host, Lloyd Geit. Joining me today, the author of a brand new book, Speak Truth to Power, the story of Charles Patriack, a civil rights pioneer. The book was actually written by his daughter, Mignette, Patriack Dorsey. Thank you so much for joining us on Straight Talk.
It is a pleasure to be here with you.
1954, an incident happened, a very unfortunate incident involving your father in Birmingham, Alabama.
That is correct.
Tell me about that.
Well, very interesting incident. It sort of changed things in Birmingham and ultimately led to things changing across the nation. My father was recently, not too far in the past, had been discharged from the military, World War II and Korean conflict. And he was just taking my brother to get a Boy Scout suit and looking for a parking space in downtown Birmingham, Alabama, December 1954, and found one. Waited for the driver to pull out, and a woman blocked the space. A white woman blocked the space and wouldn't let him have it. And so he got out the car, being the military man he was. And he told her, "Ma'am, I was waiting for the space." And she said, "Well, I want that space, and my husband is a police officer."
The police chief is no, he was a police officer,
he was
not the chief.
He was an officer.
Okay,
he was a patrolman. And my father's, retorted, "Well, he doesn't own the streets of Birmingham."
This is a black man talking to a white woman in 1954.
Exactly, but personality, hey, what can I say? So he got in his car and drove off and let her have space. Found another space, but that evening, sure enough, these two officers showed up at the door and arrested my father. Now, these were the beat cops, not her husband, thank goodness. So they knew my father. But they took him to jail. And that evening, the two officers, her husband and his partner, showed up and proceeded to nearly beat my father to death. And someone called off the beating, but they let him sit in jail for 2 days. But after that, something that rarely happened was that when my father stood before the judge to address these charges of vagrancy and disorderly conduct, he told the truth. Most African Americans stood before a judge after their beating in the Birmingham jail, and they just said, "Well, I fell."
Now, this was quite common, beatings of African Americans by white people. So this was nothing unusual.
No, the beating in jail was not unusual. What was unusual was that he told the truth. He just said, "Well, those two officers over there, they came and they beat me." And actually, it was the warden and one officer who held his arms, and the other one administered the beating. So, it was just very unusual. Now, and then there were a series of very unusual events. And the other was that the judge, who was not known for his love of African American people, decided to take the case under advisement. And ultimately, the police chief decided to fire the two officers. And but then when they immediately hired them back, the mayor and another commissioner immediately hired them back. Another unusual event was that the citizens, the white citizens, just went ballistic and said, "We want these guys fired." "What do you mean?" They went and beat, well, at that time they were using the word Negro. They beat a black man in jail. "We want them fired. We don't want them representing us on the street." That was very unusual for white citizens to write letters to the editor, to write the politicians and say, actually telling them, "We're going to vote you out of office because of what you did hiring those two officers back." So there were other things that were also very unusual, but that was sort of the first series of things that happened.
It's a fascinating book. We're going to talk more about this, but we're going to take a break. Well, we will be back right after this. Stay with us.
Oh, come on. Oops. Yeah, sure. Let's go.
Moms everywhere are finding ways to keep kids active and healthy.
Works every time.
Get ideas, get involved, get going at letsmove.gov.
And welcome back to Straight Talk. My guest is the author of a new book called Speak Truth to Power. It's the story of Charles Patriack, who was her father, a civil rights pioneer. First of all, let's back up a little bit. I want you to tell me how severely your father was beaten in 1954 in Birmingham, Alabama, by these white police officers. How severe was it?
They allowed the beating to go on quite a while. The assistant warden just sort of, I guess, oversaw it after he made him come out of the cell. They beat, of course, hit him with their fists. But when he fell, that's when the kicking began. And one of the things they did was they split his chin. And at 92 years old, he still has a split. It's an indentation, rather deep indentation in his chin. And they beat him. Apparently, he had internal injuries as well, because the newspaper articles I read, and there were a lot of newspaper articles, it was widely covered, said that he had been vomiting blood. And so he could not work for quite a while.
They also stomped him on his neck, didn't they?
Yes, they kicked him about his head, his neck, and his shoulders, and as my father said, his private parts. And so basically they gave him an all-over body kicking.
Now, normally when police in Birmingham, Alabama would beat black men, they'd go to court and they'd say, when the judge asked them what happened, they'd say, oh, I fell, or I bumped into this, and how do you explain all these injuries? Your father didn't do that.
No.
That was the thing that was unusual.
That was the first unusual thing, that when he stood before that judge and the judge said, where did you get those injuries? And he said, he did not say, I fell, Your Honor. He said, those officers, and he pointed out the officers in the court. He said, those officers did this to me. Very unusual.
Why did he tell the truth? He had that conversation with your mother, but
yes, he
why
did.
did he tell the truth?
Well, he had friends. He was an employee of a SIPCO, and they kept telling him, you need to tell the truth. This needs to stop. This happens all the time, and it needs to stop. And if you lose your life, then fine, but you need to sacrifice yourself and you need to tell the truth. My mother was a firm believer in just telling the truth. My father hired a white attorney whose father was a very powerful judge in Alabama, and his attorney, Malcolm Wheeler, said, tell the truth. Just tell the truth. We don't know what's going to happen, but tell the truth. And that's what he did.
He could have been killed for telling the truth.
He expected to. He expected to be lynched. But he said that he was a believer in Jesus Christ. He said he believed that he would go to heaven if they killed him. He also told his brother, if they do kill me, to raise my kids. And so he was expecting to be killed. And it was, I think he told me later, he was rather surprised that he wasn't.
The surprising thing is that the white community, several people in the white community said, no, this is wrong. This is wrong. That's what's really unusual about this whole
That
thing.
was another thing, because you see, the Caucasians in Birmingham were so silent, I don't know that anyone knew that they cared. Well, Bull Connor was sort of in power. Well, when this happened to my father, Eugene Bull Connor was not in power.
That's a good thing.
That's a good thing. Yeah.
That police chief was a notorious hater
Absolutely.
of African Americans.
And very brutal.
Oh yeah, very brutal.
Strong ties to the Klan, and everyone knew it, and he wasn't ashamed of it. And but he had an indiscretion, we'll say, in the early 50s.
Scandalous.
Those who are familiar with history know what he did.
What did he do? Shame on him. It was something bad, wasn't it?
Well, today he probably would have gotten an award, but back then it was bad. And so he decided not to run for re-election, and he was not in power when this happened to my father. There was another more progressive police chief, Lindbergh, was in power, and so he was dedicated to cleaning up the police force.
We're going to get back to this, but we're going to take a break right now. We will come back with mignette Patrick Dorsey. Stay with us.
And 30. Oh! Yo, hey, Allison.
What's going on?
Working on my free throws, just on 30 straight.
30? That's not possible.
Maybe not possible for you, but I've been practicing.
Step back and give me the rock.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
1, 2, 11. You know it's harder when people are watching.
Hey, you know, 11's not that bad. All you need are a few pointers.
Thank you. Are you a free throw expert?
Well, no, not really, but I do know excellent teamwork when I see it. It's so much easier to get active and live healthier when your friends are there to motivate you with a little friendly competition.
Now let's get this game started. Oh, she's going for the hook shot. Hook shot. That's what I'm talking about.
America.
Let's get healthy together.
All right, guys, we gotta be smarter about what we bite on, okay? I want everyone to go outside. We're gonna run Red Rover on 3.
What about you, Tony?
I'm gonna run around in circles, flap my arms, and make engine noises like this.
When it comes to playing, we kids are the pros.
We're eating right, too.
We fuel up.
To play 60!
If your school doesn't have a program, be a leader. Start one.
Click today and join the movement.
When life's this hard, it's no wonder 7,000 students drop out every school day. Visit boostup.org and help kids in your community stay in school.
And welcome back to Straight Talk. I'm your host, Lloyd Geit. My guest is mignette Patrick Dorsey. She has written a wonderful book about her father. It's called Speak Truth to Power, the story of Charles Patrick, a civil rights pioneer. Now, your father initially was represented by a white attorney.
That is correct.
But then a very astute, very intelligent African-American attorney took over the case. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, there were 3 trials, basically. The first one was the city trial where the Malcolm Wheeler, the Caucasian attorney, got him exonerated. The charges were dropped, and he didn't have to pay a fine or anything for vagrancy or disorderly conduct. But Mr. Wheeler made it clear that he didn't want to go any further, and my father wanted them fired permanently. They had rehired them, and my father wanted them permanently fired, so he knew that he would have to go before the personnel board to request their termination. Well, Malcolm Wheeler did not want to go any further, and so I understand they parted ways. It was amicable, but they agreed to part ways. Well, my father didn't have an attorney, so he just went alone, and that was another unusual thing about this. In addition to all of the citizen outcry, he went alone and filed handwritten charges against these officers, requesting that they be reviewed and terminated. And the personnel board agreed to look into the case. And at that point, he was able to incur the support of 2 NAACP attorneys, and that was Orzel Billingsley and Peter Hall. And they used to work with Arthur Shores, who once did a lot of work with Thurgood Marshall. So they were very well known, very accustomed to arguing cases in the Supreme Court. They were very good. And they represented him before the personnel board and presided over that case. And the officers, 2 of the officers were fired, and the 3rd, they gave him a 10-day suspension. So that was the second trial.
Now tell me a little bit about this white woman, because she comes back into view at the trial. There were people who actually saw what happened that day.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about her story, because it starts to fall apart.
It does, and in fact, we were able to get our hands on the court records, and Malcolm Wheeler also found some witnesses who were at the scene, and she basically was saying that he rammed her car into hers and ran to her car door and rattled the handle and tried to get in, and was banging on the window, just crazy things that didn't happen. And there were witnesses that said they never heard him curse, they never heard him do anything like that, that he actually drove off. And then the citizens, when they wrote letters, they made comments that this woman took advantage of the fact that her husband was an officer, and they did not support her at all. And so I don't know. It was just a weird thing. But I think, again, it happened all the time.
But now her husband never did anything to your father. It was just the co-workers. Actually, he was one of the officers.
Yes, he was
exactly. He was one of the officers
who came to the jail, and his partner. His name was Arthur Lynch, and his partner was Jack Sinyard. And the warden who let them in was Earl Jackson, and the 3 of them assaulted him.
Well, the good thing is that he didn't that police officer didn't show up at your house, at your father's house.
And that's what I wrote about that. My father was so happy that he did not show up at the house. to arrest him. But unbeknown to my father at the time, the FBI had launched an investigation, and his name was James Roby. He was the special agent in charge in 1954 of the FBI, and he launched an investigation. And after the officers were fired, that's when he sent his findings to the Justice Department, and an indictment was returned at the federal level against all 3 officers for violating his civil rights. Now, that particular trial was held in June of 1955, and he did not win that trial. They found him, they just basically said the officers had done nothing wrong. But the interesting thing was that a lot of the people who were representing him later became very famous. Johnson was the attorney who represented him at the federal trial, and he later became famous for being one of the judges who voted to sort of eliminate segregation on the Montgomery, Alabama transportation system as a result of the Rosa Parks incident and the lawsuit that resulted. So, it was interesting to see these people unknown at the time, in my father's case, seeing them in court, and then later they became famous.
But most of us think, when we think in terms of the civil rights movement, we think that the civil rights movement began with Rosa Parks.
Well, we do, yeah.
But this clearly tells us that way before Rosa Parks, there were individual African Americans fighting racism and segregation.
And it's unfortunate that their stories were buried. And even prior to my father, I read how in the 1940s, African American women would fight with bus conductors. Bus drivers, they didn't want to sit in the back of the bus. This was 1940. And so these things happened all the time. I think it was a lady, Claudette Colvin, that did the same things Rosa Parks did, and for other reasons that are suspect, but I don't know for sure. She did not receive the notoriety or the attention, shall we say, that Rosa Parks received. But no, Rosa Parks was one woman. But see, the other thing about Miss Parks and my father, people like my father, Miss Parks had attended Highlander. It was a school for participatory democracy, where they learned how to nonviolent sort of confrontation. And so she was very much prepared for what she did. And my father just did it on principle. And I think the fact that he was very military and very much a Christian and had no fear, so to speak, that's what sort of spurred him to do what he did. So it's a big difference between the two.
We're going to take a break, but we will be back with mignette Patrick Dorsey after this.
In 1977, an 8-year-old boy picked up the game of golf from his father. The odds of that same boy winning the US Open twice, 1 in 1.2 billion. The odds of him having a child diagnosed with autism, 1 in 110. Ernie Els encourages you to learn the signs of autism.
When it's time for lunch, a sandwich is a quick and easy choice. And with the right ingredients, it can be good and good for you. So I'm here today to see who can build the ultimate sandwich. All right, when the time is up, our judges will give you their scores. Ready, set, go! Okay, Jason starts out with a multi-grain roll. Ooh, Allison stuffing her pita with, yes, spinach, a great source of iron. Jason isn't skipping on the protein, adding plenty of smoked turkey, just like Allison's putting the finishing touches with crispy red bell peppers for a dose of vitamin A. Time! It looks like we have a tie. We'll need to call in our special guest referee.
Now, these are what I call quick, delicious lunches. Whole grain breads, a whole variety of ingredients. There are so many different ways to build delicious, healthy sandwiches. These two get high marks in every category. I'd say you're both winners. America.
Let's get healthy together.
Mom, can I have $1?
Yeah, it's right. I think my purse is upstairs on the bed.
It's not here.
Check the dining room.
No.
What about your sister's room?
It's not there either.
The upstairs closet? The downstairs closet?
There are no more closets.
Moms everywhere are finding ways to keep kids active and healthy. Get ideas, get involved, get going at letsmove.gov.
When life's this hard, it's no wonder 7,000 students drop out every school day. Visit boostup.org and help kids in your community stay in school.
And welcome back to Straight Talk. I'm your host, Lloyd Geit. My guest is mignette Patrick Dorsey. She's written a very engaging book called Speak Truth to Power, the story of Charles Patrick, a civil rights pioneer. That, of course, was her father. Your dad is now 92 years old.
He is.
What happened after all of this stuff was settled? Now, the third trial, was anything settled?
Well, the only thing really was that they decided that the officers did not violate his civil rights, but they did not get their jobs back as patrolmen. So that was settled. That was settled. But then my dad decided, as a result of a confrontation that my brother, my 12-year-old brother, he was confronted by 12 white men who were inquiring as to whose son he was. And they knew that he was Charles Patrick's son. And so my dad realized that they were going to try and hurt his children. So for that reason, he packed up the family and moved us to Los Angeles. And that's where I was born and raised, and my sister. And so that's the aftermath. But then after, he raised us, they eventually resettled back home. But, it was just, at 92, it's amazing that he still can remember all of this. And some details are fuzzy, but for the most part, he can remember what happened 57 years ago.
Now, why did you write this book? I mean, you were a columnist. You did fashion kinds of things as a writer. Why did you decide to write this book on your father?
Well, it was two reasons. First of all, as a reporter, it was a story that should have been told. But as his daughter, I felt like there was an omission. And I felt like that history, that he should have his place in it, especially with the story being so widely publicized in '54. But really, it was two editors at the...
It made national news. It was in the Jet magazine as well.
It was. In fact, it made the wire. AP picked it up in the 50s, and it just sort of went... Dad said it was international, and it might have been. But definitely it went national. But there was two editors at the Post who really challenged me to tell the story when I told them one day about it. They said, "What are you doing here? You're writing at this newspaper, and you've got this history that you're sitting on." And of course, I grew up reading the articles from a child, so I just decided when I found a photo of my dad on the cover of the paper at that time, and his eyes teared up, and I just said, I have to do this story. So that's why I did it.
Of course, are glad that you did do the story, because we would not have known about this man's struggle. Is your dad bitter after all this time? Was he ever bitter?
No, he really wasn't. He understood that he was living in a country that just did not appreciate people of color. And so he understood that. And really, he told me he was very much willing to stay in his place. He was not an activist. People use the term Charles Patrick the activist. He was not an activist. He was very low-key. He really did, as he put it, want to stay in his place. But he was a very bold man, and if you backed him in a corner, he was going to come out fighting.
He also knew right from wrong.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And so he didn't need to march in a crowd. He didn't need that. He didn't seek that. He never had done that. He had never marched in a crowd. Now, as a result of his case, there were rallies at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama at that time. But I don't know that he even spoke. He just attended. So certainly his attorneys didn't speak.
Now, just recently, he was given an award.
He was. The April 4th Foundation, named for the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., awarded him the Open Door Award, which is given to those who have opened doors for others related to the civil rights. And Dad lived long enough he's still alive, and he lived long enough to see it, and so we were very pleased. And he gave his speech. I thought he was going to ramble, but he did good. He just kept it short, to the point, thanked them and thanked God, and he sat down.
Are you glad that you wrote the book? Are you satisfied?
There is a relief that I feel that it's written, because, again, it was a project that was 15 years off and on, researching it, and then with it being an academic press, I mean, it's the University of Alabama Press, it was very tough because they have very high standards. Being an academic press, they have very, very tough, the oversight was very tough, but that's what I wanted, because they're from that region of the country, and I just wanted a press that understood the civil rights and that whole Southern history, and boy, did they understand it. They got it. So they really helped me out a lot with a lot of things.
I think there are two amazing things about the book. First of all, that this was way before Rosa Parks, and that the white community, segments of the white community, came to the aid of your father. We don't hear these kinds of stories.
No, and it's unfortunate because not all white citizens were racist. They were segregationists in many cases, but they did not like what happened to my father. And it's one thing not to like it, it's another thing to put it in writing and sign your name. I actually found the letters, and I quote quite a few of them, where they are expressing their dissatisfaction about what happened and demanding that they fire those officers permanently from the force. And that just had not happened that I ever found, that the whites just went on record. And so it's unfortunate that we don't understand as a nation that history. It's sort of like the history just got buried. And the African Americans were very active. I mean, they were, they couldn't sign their names to letters and send it to the white-owned newspapers like the white citizens would do it, but certainly they were raising money for him at 16th Street Baptist Church. They were paying his medical expenses. They were paying his house note, his financial, they were taking care of him. And so the black community and the white community, while they didn't come together cohesively, they were in their own ways supporting him and publicly. And so it was that, again, especially with the white community, just by 1954, coming out on record, very unusual.
Now, let's say that people want to get the book. What do they do? How do they get it?
Well, I understand that Barnes & Noble does have copies in various sites across the country, certainly Amazon.com. And if they go to my website, SpeakTruthToPower, numeral2power.com, they can link to the publisher and purchase it directly from the publisher, University of Alabama Press.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us. It is always a real treat to talk to you, but on this particular book, I really think that you've done a wonderful job.
Thank you. It's good that it's over, but it was a pleasure writing it and putting my dad's story and just it's American history and adding to that whole concept of what has happened in this country.
Good. We've been talking with Mignette Patriack Dorsey. She is the author of a new book called Speak Truth to Power, the story of Charles Patriack, a civil rights pioneer. That, of course, was her father. We want to thank you for joining us on Straight Talk. We will see you next week with yet another exciting show. Take care.
Straight Talk with award-winning journalist Lloyd Geit.